My wife told her friend, "I'm having dinner with my boss tonight," and it sounded so natural for someone who had already learned to lie without blinking. There was no hesitation in her voice, no pause between words. But there was one detail she could never have predicted: I was there, in the next hallway, listening to everything. Pretending to be searching for some random document, my eyes fixed on nothing, my chest already beginning to fill with a strange air, a kind of silent suffocation. She spoke so calmly, with that rehearsed sweetness, that for a second I almost wanted to believe her. But my intuition was no longer foolish. I knew something had changed. And that night, instead of going home, I went to the restaurant she said she never set foot in, where she said it was too noisy, too crowded, too indiscreet. Funny how the most avoided places become perfect havens for encounters that shouldn't be seen. I found them both in the darkest corner of the room. Hand in hand. Her fingers intertwined with his as if searching for some kind of reassurance. She was smiling. Not the smile she gave at home, after a long day. It was a lighter, looser, more passionate smile. A smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I saw them before they saw me. I sat at the next table, my heart pounding in my ears and my hand trembling on the menu, pretending to choose something. There was no anger. Only a silence inside me that screamed. I waited a few minutes. Long enough to be sure it wasn't just my imagination, that the affection between them wasn't a misunderstanding, but intention. And when I saw her eyes rest on his as if waiting for promises, I understood everything. I got up without anyone noticing. I left without making a scene. Because what really kills is not the scream. It's the silence. The next day, I simply wrote, "You traded our story for a secondary role." She replied hours later, calling me by name as if that could bring me back. "It wasn't what you think." But it was. And more. More than I could explain. More than she could justify. And when she finally found the courage to admit it, she said he'd never promised anything, that she didn't know how it started, that she thought it was just a distraction, that she felt invisible at home, that she was confused. Confused. The word hurt me more than the betrayal itself. Because while I woke up early, made coffee, left loving notes on the refrigerator door, she fell in love in silence. While I believed we were going through a difficult time, she decided our story could be paused, torn apart, betrayed. While I waited for her to arrive, she feigned delays, dressed up for someone else, and served me fatigue. The kind of fatigue that has nothing to do with the body, but with the soul that no longer wants to stay. In the following days, emptiness filled the house as if it were a new resident. Her side of the bed grew cold. Her scent slowly left the clothes, the pillows, the souvenirs. But her eyes still haunted me. When I packed my bags, it wasn't the end of a marriage. It was the end of a world I believed to be true. And she remained. With the regrets, with the silences, with the poorly stitched memories trying to make sense of a mistake she herself made. She said she loved me. That she still loved me. But love, when betrayed, breaks in a way that cannot be undone. You may be forgiven. But you will never be the same again. She reached out to me. Days later, weeks later. I texted her to say I was okay. Not for her sake, but for mine. I said I held no grudges. That I was learning to move on. But what I didn't tell her, what she never knew, is that I spent entire nights awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering where we'd lost each other. Trying to understand how someone chooses another over a home. How certainty is traded for adventure. How loyalty is replaced by curiosity. She said she didn't want to hurt me. And maybe that was true. But betrayal doesn't have to be intentional to destroy. Time passed. And, unlike everything they say, it didn't heal, but it taught me. It showed me that love isn't enough when respect is lacking. That loyalty isn't a promise, it's a choice. That not every mistake deserves a comeback. And that sometimes, forgiving isn't about getting back together, it's about setting free. Setting free the other, and most importantly, yourself. I met someone else. Not the kind who arrives with fireworks, but the kind who arrives with peace. No need to play games. No hiding her phone. No smiles that don't belong to me. A woman who doesn't keep me awake wondering where she is, who she's with, what she's feeling. And then, on one of those ordinary days that promise nothing, she came back. The ex. The woman who swore it was just a one-time thing, who said it was just neediness, who loved me for real. He knocked on my door with tears in his eyes. He said he saw me in his dreams. That, every night, he saw me leaving. And he never looked back. And she woke up crying. I woke up calling my name in the dark. She said she slept hugging the pillow on my side of the bed, which was now always empty. She said she tried to love again, but no one had my laughter. That his touch was cold. That conversation died halfway through. That dinners tasted like silence. She said she regretted it. Not the next day, but the day she realized I wasn't coming back. And there, with her eyes wet and her voice choked, I understood what silence does. It doesn't scream. But it takes revenge. And the greatest revenge is absence. Because she still wakes at night searching for me in her dreams. And me? I wake up next to someone who chose to stay. Who never made me doubt. Who never turned away from the love I had to give. Because in the end, love only blossoms where there's room for it to grow. And there, in that house where she chose to lie, there was no more fertile soil. Only dry memories, and a regret that was now hers alone. But the story of how it all happened, of the unsaid details, of the avoided glances, of the first time I realized she didn't love me anymore, and of what she did after she lost everything, still needs to be told. And what she told me at our last meeting, her voice low and her heart broken, still echoes in my head. Because then, I understood that not all forgiveness saves. Some only frees. And she never slept peacefully again. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, never. The stories you will hear are fictions based on real situations, created with a single purpose, to deeply demonstrate how betrayal destroys loves, homes, and entire lives. Each storyline mirrors what can happen when someone chooses to deceive the one they trusted most. Get ready. What's coming next is a story strong, exciting and shocking. Take a deep breath, and listen to the end. His name was Daniel. She was Emily. They were the kind of couple who, to outsiders, seemed to have beaten all odds, two young people who met while still in college, who built their careers side by side, who faced the hardships of their early years together and celebrated, as an intimate and silent achievement, each small victory that time brought them. Their story didn't begin with a romantic movie, nor did it feature vows on bridges or marriage proposals amidst rain and music in the background. It began with an unpretentious conversation in a university cafeteria, where the two, still immature and dreamers, discovered they had more in common than they imagined. Daniel had that calm, almost too calm, manner that conveyed security and patience. Emily, on the other hand, was intense, impulsive, a mixture of charm and urgency for everything she dreamed of experiencing. He listened to her as if each word were a new universe. She leaned on him like someone finding shelter after a storm. And there, in the unglamorous everyday, a genuine love began to blossom. The apartment they lived in reflected their personalities. It wasn't large, but it was full of details that told their story. Books were stacked everywhere, paintings with travel photos, an antique coffee maker Emily loved even though it didn't work properly, and a worn sofa where they spent entire afternoons watching movies that never ended, because they always preferred to talk. The neighbors knew them by name, seeing them go downstairs together in the morning and return at the end of the day sharing grocery bags, laughing at some inside joke no one else would understand. They were the kind of couple who made it seem possible that love, when cultivated calmly, could flourish even in imperfect soil. Daniel worked in architecture. He had a meticulous mind, passionate about building and planning spaces where people could feel at home. Emily, on the other hand, was a project manager in a more dynamic, fast-paced field. While he spent hours focused on technical drawings, she dealt with meetings, tight deadlines, and difficult decisions. Their routines were different, but they met every night in that small kitchen where they cooked together, or on that worn sofa where he listened to her stories of the day while stroking her hair. They were partners. Friends. Accomplices. In the early years, everything seemed to work with admirable ease. They weren't perfect, they argued, yes, over trivial matters and serious ones alike. They'd slept back to back, slammed doors, cried in front of each other. But they always came back. They always sought each other out again. There was a rare feeling between them that, even on bad days, it was still worth it. And that was exactly what sustained them. Emily had a sharp sense of humor, able to laugh even in the most difficult situations, while Daniel offered the kind of calm that stabilized even the most unexpected storms. He was the kind of man who paid attention to details. He remembered the date of their first trip, saved old notes, noticed when she changed the shade of her perfume. And she, without even saying it, felt protected by it. As the years passed, however, something subtle began to change. Little things that had previously been ignored began to weigh on her. Her schedule became increasingly unpredictable, and Daniel, by his patient nature, tried not to make a problem of it. He understood that Emily was advancing in her career, that her position demanded ever greater dedication. He waited. He prepared dinner. He left the lights on. He texted her to ask if she wanted it heated up. And she almost always replied that she had already eaten out, that she was tired, and that she would make up for it tomorrow. Daniel never complained. But deep down, he was beginning to feel like they were silently drifting apart. Emily, for her part, felt something inside her changing as well. The pressures of work, the new responsibilities, and the interaction with people from very different backgrounds began to make her question whether she was still the same girl who met Daniel in that coffee shop. She still loved him, still moved by his gestures, but there was a growing uneasiness in her chest. Sometimes she caught herself looking at him with affection, but also with a certain nostalgia, as if that love were trapped in time, frozen in a version of them that perhaps no longer existed. She didn't talk about it to anyone. Not even him. She kept it to herself, like someone hiding a nagging doubt she doesn't yet have the courage to face. Gradually, their routine stopped being a date and became a coincidence of schedules. Dinner together became rare. Conversations became shorter. Silences, longer. Daniel missed her even when she was around. Emily found herself distracted, often with her mind elsewhere, and she didn't know exactly why. But weekends still had their moments. They still held hands for walks, still watched TV shows together, still shared plans for the future. There was love. But there was also a kind of invisible distance, something that not even the tightest hugs could bridge. A symbolic moment was Daniel's birthday. She forgot. Or rather, she remembered too late. She was stuck in a meeting, swamped with commitments, and when she got home, he was already asleep. The next day, she tried to make amends with an improvised gift and a hurried apology. He smiled and said everything was fine, but it wasn't. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Emily noticed, but didn't know what to do. And Daniel, as usual, swallowed it in silence. Even so, their love persisted. Perhaps out of habit. Perhaps out of memory. Or perhaps because, deep down, there was still something strong enough to hold them there. But it was as if they were on opposite sides of a bridge that, little by little, was beginning to crumble. And neither of them knew quite how to rebuild it. On a random Saturday, they decided to take a short trip, just the two of them. It was an attempt to reconnect, to reclaim something that seemed lost in everyday life. They went to a secluded spot, with beautiful scenery and a simple cottage where they had stayed before, years ago. There, between hikes and wine by the fire, there was laughter, there were kisses, there was love. But there were also deep silences. Emily, at times, seemed to be there in body, but far away in mind. And Daniel, attentive, began to realize that, despite all their efforts, there was something between them that could no longer be touched. The return was silent. Each one immersed in their own thoughts, pretending everything was fine. But they knew it wasn't. And still, no words were spoken. The words that mattered began to fail, and in their place, absences grew. Emily began arriving later and later. Daniel stopped waiting. He started making dinners just for himself, sleeping without leaving the lamp on. Their love was still there, but wounded. Fragile. Hidden beneath a layer of indifference that grew with each passing day. Around that time, Emily began reaching out to new people. Different people, with quick conversations, with bolder interests, with rhythms that challenged the predictability in which she lived. She wasn't seeking anything, at least not consciously. But she let herself be carried away. And without even realizing it, she began hiding little things. Silly things. Schedules, messages, meetings. Things she used to tell Daniel naturally and now kept silent by choice. And Daniel, despite not knowing the details, felt it. He didn't need proof. He felt it in the tone of their voice, the change in their gestures, the sudden coldness of their hugs. Something was wrong. But he didn't ask. Maybe out of fear of the answer. Maybe out of pride. Or out of love. The house, once full of life, began to sound hollow. The laughter diminished. The games faded. The nights became too long. Emily lived on autopilot. Daniel, in the past. And the present, that became a minefield where any word could explode what little remained. And then, unbeknownst to him, everything was about to change. Because things were happening behind the scenes. Words were spoken to others. Promises were exchanged in silence. Paths were being traced in parallel, while he still believed it was just a phase. He was still making plans. She no longer knew how to confess that hers had changed. And so, day after day, minute after minute, the love that was once home became ruin. But no one had the courage to say it out loud. Not yet. Not yet. That morning, Emily left earlier than usual. He said he had an important presentation at work and needed to review everything before the meeting. Daniel, already accustomed to unpredictable schedules, simply nodded with a brief kiss on her forehead and wished her luck. Inside, something weighed heavily, as if her body knew of an emptiness her mind hadn't yet grasped. In recent days, Emily had been more distant, more introspective. Her eyes looked tired, but not with physical fatigue, it was something deeper, more confusing. And yet, she smiled, as if she'd practiced each gesture to appear natural. Daniel, not wanting to pressure her, continued to pretend not to notice. If ignorance protects, love forgives all even before confession. Emily got into the car and took a deep breath. She glanced at herself in the rearview mirror and smoothed her hair with trembling hands. She looked different. There was a new guilt in her eyes, mixed with an excitement she couldn't quite comprehend. In her purse was a perfume she hadn't used in months, reserved only for special occasions. And that morning, for some reason she refused to articulate, she chose it. As she started the car and drove down the road, the radio played an old song she used to sing with Daniel on Sunday drives. She changed the station. She didn't want memories. Just silence. And haste. Daniel spent the morning trying to work, but his concentration often failed him. The project at hand required attention to detail, and yet, all he could see was the shadow of a slowly growing doubt, like a crack in the ceiling. He considered texting Emily, asking if she'd had lunch, if the presentation went well, but something made him stop. A new fear crept in. As if, by writing, he were confirming what her silence already screamed. He glanced at his phone and put it aside. He went to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat on the porch, as he did on days when he needed to think. And in that moment, he realized how much he'd been thinking to himself lately. The previous night had been cold. They slept without exchanging many words. She had returned late, saying she was exhausted, and Daniel simply responded with a kiss on her forehead. He felt her turn to the other side of the bed in a hurry, avoiding any proximity. He lay there, his eyes open, listening to her breathing and trying to understand where they had begun to lose each other. Her pillow no longer smelled the same. Her side of the bed seemed further away than it actually was. And the time between them, the time that used to be complicit, now only accumulated in heavy silences. That afternoon, Daniel received an unusual call. It was from Emily's sister. She was calling to confirm a family lunch on Sunday, but her tone sounded hesitant and uncomfortable. At the end of the conversation, she mentioned something Daniel couldn't ignore. She asked if Emily liked the gift she'd left with her new boss last week. Daniel, confused, pretended to understand and quickly said goodbye. But the question resonated. He didn't know about any gift. He didn't know about any new boss. And that detail, as small as a pebble in his shoe, brought him back to the beginning. He sat on the porch again, and this time, he began connecting the dots. In recent months, she'd been talking about a new project at work, but she'd never mentioned names. She'd said the team was large, the pressure was enormous, but she'd never told stories, as she usually did. No jokes about colleagues. No criticism of managers. Just vague references. And then, that mention of the new boss seemed to open a door he hadn't known existed. The discomfort grew. The coffee went cold. And a feeling that something was deeply wrong gripped him with a vengeance. That same late afternoon, Emily sent a short message saying she would be staying late at the office. Daniel responded with a simple, "Okay," but this time, he decided to act differently. He waited until it was dark. He showered slowly, put on some modest clothing, and quietly left the house. He knew the restaurant Emily always avoided. A beautiful place, but known for being busy and full of watchful eyes. She said it was too noisy, that it didn't suit her, and that's why they never went there. But suddenly, that was exactly the place he wanted to visit. He arrived at the place and sat at a discreet table in the corner opposite the entrance. He ordered just a drink and began to observe the surroundings. Time seemed to slow. Every person who entered was scrutinized. Every couple who sat down was studied with a growing unease in his stomach. And then, amid the coming and going of the waiters, he saw her. Emily entered with a tall, well-dressed man with an easy smile. They sat at a more private table, but not as hidden as they might have imagined. She looked beautiful. Black dress, hair loose, light makeup. Daniel didn't know whether to freeze or stand up. His trembling hand held the glass as if it were his only anchor to the ground. There was no doubt. This wasn't a work meeting. There was no briefcase, no laptop, no formality. Expensive wine was being served. There was low laughter. Eyes met and lingered too long. And then, there was a touch. Her hand slid across the table until they found his. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they'd done it before. As if it were habit. And what Daniel had always feared but never had the courage to name finally became an image. There, betrayal took shape, color, and temperature. He didn't feel anger. He felt a different emptiness, as if his body were still there, but his soul had already departed. He stood there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. Stand up and confront them. Scream. Cry. But none of these reactions seemed to make sense for the kind of pain now growing inside him. Instead, the answer came in the form of silence. He calmly stood up, left money on the table, and left without them noticing. The world outside remained the same. Cars passed. People laughed. The city went about its business, oblivious to the silent rupture that had just occurred. At home, Daniel didn't cry. Not that it didn't hurt, it hurt like never before. But it was a dry, contained pain that seemed to tear from within without leaving any visible marks. He went inside, turned out the lights, went to his room, and lay down. Emily only returned hours later. She said she was tired. She kissed him on the cheek and turned onto her side, as she had done for weeks. Daniel remained awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a choice that hadn't yet been made, but which, deep down, had already been decided. The next day, he woke before her. He made coffee as he did every morning. But this time, he left only one cup on the table. His. He picked up his phone and wrote a few, but precise, words. Words that didn't require an explanation, that left no room for apologies. It was the end. And when Emily woke up and read it, there was no immediate response. Because sometimes, silence speaks for everyone. But what Daniel didn't yet know, what Emily never thought he would discover, was that that night wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the fall. Because there was something more. Something she'd never had the courage to tell. And that secret was about to emerge. Emily reappeared days later, as if the time between silence and guilt had given her a new, but shaky, courage. She didn't call. She didn't write. She knocked on the door. And when Daniel opened it, she was different. Her face was haggard, her eyes sunken, her makeup almost non-existent, as if she'd been trying to maintain an appearance that couldn't withstand even the first tear along the way. He said nothing. He simply gave her space. She entered slowly, like someone treading on ground they knew could give way at any moment. The house, which I'd once known so intimately, now felt strange. Every object, every smell, every detail was a painful reminder of everything she'd thrown away. She sat on the sofa, the same one where they'd laughed so often together, and for a few seconds, the silence weighed more heavily than any words. Daniel remained standing, watching her with the coldness of someone wounded beyond repair. The kind of pain that doesn't explode, but burns slowly inside. She tried to begin, but her voice faltered. She took a deep breath, clasped her hands in her lap, and said she didn't expect forgiveness, that she didn't come with excuses, that she couldn't move on without telling the truth. Daniel remained silent, his gaze fixed, as if waiting for the final blow even though he'd already fallen. Emily said that the man from the restaurant, her supposed boss, was no longer in her life. Not because she wanted him to be, but because he simply disappeared after she told him the marriage was over. She said there had been no promises from him, that she had believed in something that only existed in her own head. Daniel listened, impassive. It wasn't news. It was predictable. But Emily wasn't there to tell him about the end of an affair, there was something else, something buried, that now felt heavier than ever. With teary eyes, she looked up and said something Daniel never expected to hear. She said that in the last few weeks before the end, she had dreamed about him every night. Not about Daniel, but about the Daniel who was leaving her. A recurring dream. Always the same scenario, he left through a door she couldn't open, and never looked back. She woke up crying, desperate, feeling an emptiness so real it was as if she had lost someone forever. At first, she thought it was guilt. But the dream continued, every night, like a warning, like a punishment she couldn't decipher. Daniel remained motionless. Her voice was the only thing filling the air. She told him that on their last night together, when he went to sleep without saying a word, she had had that same dream. But with a new twist. In the dream, she screamed his name, begging him not to leave her, and he would stop for a second, turn his face, and say with cruel calm, "Now you understand what it's like to be invisible." And then he would leave. She woke up suffocated, her face wet with tears and a tightness in her chest that seemed to never go away. It was then that she realized it wasn't just remorse. It was something else. Something eating away at her insides. She got up from the sofa, walked to the center of the room, and looked directly into his eyes. She said that that day, after the dream, she tried to dial his number, but didn't have the courage. She said she thought about going to his work, about making up any excuse, but couldn't. She spent the entire day with that phrase echoing in her head. And that evening, when she finally worked up the courage to leave the house, she found something she hadn't expected: Daniel, walking beside a woman. They weren't holding hands. There was no kiss. But there was a lightness about him she hadn't seen before. A sincere, carefree smile. A kind of presence she'd never seen before while they were together. She followed them with her eyes until they entered a coffee shop. And as she approached the window, she saw Daniel pull out the other woman's chair, smile, and lean in slightly to listen to her, just like he used to in the old days. She didn't come in. She just watched. And there, standing on the sidewalk, he felt he'd lost something irretrievable. The image hadn't left his mind since. Every day, the dream returned. And with it, the certainty that the betrayal hadn't just destroyed their marriage, but everything she still believed she was capable of loving. Daniel, until then quiet, finally spoke. And his voice wasn't of anger, but of a weariness that came from deep within. He said her silence over the past few months had slowly killed him, that each excuse she made was like a knife she'd stabbed him in the back with a smile. He said it wasn't the act of betrayal that hurt the most, but the coldness of knowing she'd already left long before she admitted it. That she continued to live by his side as if she were still there, when in fact she'd already said goodbye long ago. Emily tried to interrupt, but Daniel continued. He said that forgiving wasn't about forgetting, nor going back, nor pretending nothing happened. It was just letting go. And that, even though he saw her there, stripped of masks and words, he no longer felt pain. The feeling that remained was grief. Grief for something that died slowly, suffocated by small lies, selfish choices, cowardly omissions. She began to cry. A heavy, unsteady cry, like someone understanding for the first time that the damage is irreversible. Daniel went to the door, opened it calmly, and told her she could come back whenever she wanted, but only that far. That the home they had built together was gone. That it was just a house now. That her dreams weren't punishment, they were a mirror. Because that was exactly how he'd felt for months, trapped in a nightmare where he'd screamed her name and no one answered. Emily stood still for a few seconds, as if waiting for him to regret it, to back down. But he didn't. And in that moment, she realized that forgiveness isn't a chance to start over. Sometimes, it's just confirmation that you've lost yourself forever. She left, and silence filled the room again. But this time, it was a different silence. It wasn't empty. It was light. Daniel closed the door and took a deep breath. He looked around, touched the objects in the house, sat on the sofa, and for the first time in a long time, he felt no pain. He felt peace. A kind of peace that didn't come from winning, but from surviving. From not having become bitter. From having loved with everything and, even though hurt, having chosen not to seek revenge. But there was still something to come. Something that not even Emily knew, and that Daniel would discover shortly after. Because the end of that story wasn't just about what was lost, but about what would be rebuilt. And what remained, would still come to light. 2 months had passed since that last conversation. Since the last time Emily's eyes met Daniel's without the filter of the past. Winter had given way to a shy spring, and with it came longer days, brighter mornings, and a gentle warmth that filtered through the window like a promise of a new beginning. Daniel never reached out to Emily again. Not a call, not a message. She tried a few more times, leaving messages that were unanswered, letters that perhaps were never read. And little by little, she understood that his silence was now definitive. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because, somehow, he had found something she had lost along the way, peace. Daniel, for his part, moved on. He resumed projects, visited old friends, and started playing guitar again on Saturday afternoons. What had once been empty was gradually filled with new things: a unique coffee shop he discovered near the park, a trail he hiked alone for the first time, a bookstore where he spent hours talking to a stranger who recommended a novel that touched him deeply. He wasn't looking for someone. He didn't need to fill a void. But he was no longer hurt. And that, in itself, was a new beginning. It was on a Friday night, during an art exhibition a friend had invited him to, that Daniel met the woman from the coffee shop again, the one Emily had seen him with, and finally understood that she had lost everything. Her name was Claire. She had a calm smile, a look that seemed to listen before she even spoke, and a serene way of being present, as if she carried within herself a world where things didn't need to be rushed. They talked for hours that night. About art, music, about time and the scars it leaves. Claire didn't ask invasive questions or seek answers. She simply listened. And Daniel, without realizing it, spoke of himself with a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. Their encounters became frequent. First by chance. Then by choice. There were no hasty declarations, no empty promises. Just the mutual presence of two adults who carried their own pasts but didn't let them dictate the present. With Claire, Daniel felt something rare. He didn't have to be strong all the time. He could show her his doubts, his fears, his unfinished parts. And she wasn't scared. She just stayed. This was the new love that was taking shape, not the overwhelming kind that arrives like a hurricane, but the kind that grows slowly, steadily, like a tree growing silently in safe ground. Emily learned about this through a mutual friend. The news came like a sharp blow, without warning. She was trying to move on, rebuilding her routine, hanging out with coworkers, visiting different places, trying to find some meaning in the mornings that dawned without purpose. But the truth was, nothing fulfilled her. Everything seemed pale in comparison to what she had lost. She learned that Daniel was with someone. That he seemed well. That he was smiling again. And that, instead of sparking jealousy or anger, awakened a raw, primal pain that came from a place deeper than pride. It wasn't because he'd moved on. It was because she'd taken too long to understand that he would never return. One day, as she was leaving the market, Emily saw Daniel across the street. He was with Claire. They were laughing at something silly, sharing a shopping bag, and seemed immersed in a world of their own. She stopped, instinctively, like someone seeing a ghost, not because he had died, but because he was all too alive in another life that no longer included hers. They didn't see her. She stood there, motionless, for long seconds, until the light changed and the crowd pushed her forward. She walked on with her eyes blurred, her soul heavy, and an absurd desire to go back in time. But time never comes back. It was that same night, lying in the bed that now seemed too big, that she had the dream again. She was in an empty station. It was raining. Daniel walked away, and she screamed his name, begged, cried. He didn't stop. Only at the last second did he turn his face and say, "Now you understand what it's like to be left behind." And then he disappeared. When she woke, her face was wet, the pillow was soaked, and her chest was in an impossible knot. It was the sixth time that dream had repeated itself. Always the same. Always more vivid. And deep down, she knew, it wasn't just a punishment. It was the only way her mind could find to confront her with the truth. 2 days later, Emily decided to look for someone. Not Daniel. Not Claire. But someone who could, perhaps, help her understand where everything had begun to fall apart. And it was in a conversation with her own mother that everything emerged. Between tears, confessions, and memories, Emily told him things she had never said before. She said that in the months before the betrayal, she no longer recognized herself. That she was afraid of living a life she hadn't chosen. That she didn't know if what she felt for Daniel was still love or just affection. But, most importantly, she told him something she had been carrying like a stone deep in her soul, that she hadn't betrayed him just with gestures. She betrayed him first in her heart. Long before she touched other hands, she had already stopped offering hers to him. She had become absent, cold, impatient. And when her body departed, her soul had already gone first. The mother, silent, just listened. And in the end, she said something that kept hammering in Emily's head for days to come: sometimes love dies because we stop watering it. But, daughter, you didn't realize it kept watering itself until it dried up completely. That broke her. Because it was true. Daniel fought until the end, alone. And when he stopped, she only realized it was too late. A week later, Emily called Daniel. He answered. His voice was calm, serene, as if he'd already made peace with everything. She asked to see him. She said she wouldn't bring flowers, apologies, or letters. She just wanted to look into his eyes one last time. Daniel hesitated for a few seconds, but agreed. They arranged to meet at a secluded cafe, far from the places they'd frequented together. It was neutral territory, where the ghosts of the past wouldn't be invited. Emily arrived first. She was nervous, but determined. When Daniel entered, she stood slowly. He was thinner, perhaps, or perhaps lighter. His eyes were still the same. But there was something different, something she couldn't name, but knew would never return. They sat across from each other. She didn't know where to begin. He broke the silence by asking how she was. She responded with a sad smile, saying she was surviving. And then they began to talk. No resentment. No demands. Just two old chapters trying to say goodbye with dignity. Midway through the conversation, Emily lowered her eyes, took a deep breath, and said she needed to confess something. She said that, beyond everything he already knew, there was one detail he'd never shared. That, deep down, she carried a regret worse than the betrayal. Daniel, curious, just listened. And it was there, in that moment, that she revealed that a week before everything happened, Daniel had hidden a note in her drawer. A note talking about the end of the year, about traveling together, about a surprise he was preparing. He wanted to renew their wedding vows. She found the note, read it, and still chose to go out that night with another man. Daniel was silent. Not because he felt nothing. But because it hurt in a new way. It wasn't about what she did. It was about what she ignored. Love was there, folded in paper, waiting for her. And she ignored it. Emily said she read the note, cried, but still carried on. That now she carried it as the greatest cowardice she'd ever committed. It wasn't the kiss, nor the touch. It was the conscious choice not to love back. Daniel swallowed hard. He said he didn't need to hear any more. That he already knew, even without knowing it. Because the heart feels when it's been left aside. Emily apologized. Not to get back together, but to try to sleep at night. She said she loved him, still did, but that she understood she no longer deserved it. Daniel, in a low voice, replied that he forgave her. That he wished her no harm, harbored no hatred, but that there was no longer a place for her in his new life. He said that now, he loved again. And that it was a different love, peaceful, deserved. Emily smiled through her tears. She said she was happy for him. And in that moment, she knew that what she lost would never return. As she left the cafe, she looked back and saw him sitting, staring out the window. And she thought that perhaps, for the rest of her life, he would continue to appear in her dreams. But now, no longer as someone who left. But as someone who should never have been left. The drive home was silent. Daniel drove with the windows half open, feeling the wind brush against his face as if trying to rip away the last vestiges of that conversation. There was no resentment in his thoughts, but a deep weariness, like someone finally letting go of something they'd been carrying for too long. It wasn't the kind of weariness that dissipates with a good night's sleep, it was the weariness of the soul, of someone who's heard a truth that confirms what they already sensed, but still hurts as if for the first time. Emily's revelation didn't change the ending, it only made it clearer how much she'd already left even before she physically left. It no longer caused pain, but it generated a strange melancholy. A silent mourning for everything that could have been but never was, for every gesture of love ignored, for every attempt he made to keep alive something she'd already let die in silence. When he got home, he found Claire asleep on the couch, a book on her lap, her bare feet curled up under a blanket. There was a low light on in the corner of the room and a half-empty cup on the coffee table. She had probably tried to wait, but sleep overcame her. Daniel stood there for a few seconds, just watching. The contrast between that present and the past he'd just revisited at the cafe was so intense that it created a strange sense of disconnect. Claire didn't yet know he'd seen Emily. He knew she'd looked for him, but she hadn't pressed him for details. She never pressured him. She was the type who respected time, pain, and silence. And that made everything between them happen slowly, without the need for defenses. Daniel approached slowly, carefully took the book from her hands, and stroked her hair. She opened her eyes slowly and smiled at the sight of him, asking if everything was okay. He responded with a soft kiss on her forehead and said he was now. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to his routine with a new perspective. The conversation with Emily didn't bring him relief or suffering, but she handed him a key. The key that closes a door once and for all. He began to look at himself more honestly, recognizing the scars he still carried, but also the spaces that had been filled again. There were still fears, ghosts that surfaced in small moments, like when Claire took a while to respond to a message, or when he found himself making plans and feared trusting too much. But these ghosts didn't take over. They were fleeting shadows, disappearing in the light of the simple, genuine affection that now surrounded him. Claire sensed these shadows. Sometimes she asked gently, other times she simply offered her presence silently. She knew Daniel's heart was a land of ruins. And instead of trying to rebuild everything hastily, she walked among the rubble carefully, without judgment, without forcing. It was this respect that made Daniel slowly begin to believe again in bonds that don't require suffering. Being with her was like living in a house with open windows and unlocked doors, because there, no one tried to escape. Meanwhile, Emily was immersed in a process of reconciliation with herself. Daniel's absence was no longer a hole to be filled, but a weighty absence, teaching her, with each repetition of his silence, that she wouldn't get a second chance. She began to write. Not for him, but for herself. She filled notebooks with rants, memories, regrets, letters she would never send. She looked through old photos, deleting many, keeping others. She renovated her room, removing objects that only brought painful memories. She tried to learn to deal with the echo of her choices, to understand that the forgiveness she received didn't heal the guilt, only handed it back to the one who created it. At work, she stayed focused. She tried to rebuild a routine. But it was in the silence of the nights that the weight returned with greater force. It was no longer the dreams of Daniel leaving that woke her. Now it was the emptiness beside her, the absence of a presence she could never replace. She walked the streets and saw places that had once been hers and his. Every restaurant, every park bench, every familiar path was now a reminder of a time that would never return. There was no consolation. There was only the bitter acceptance that love, once broken in this way, leaves scars that time does not erase, it only teaches us to live with them. One night, Emily decided to visit a place she had long avoided, the bookstore where Daniel used to spend his afternoons. She wanted to see if she could bear it. He walked slowly among the shelves, looking at the books as if they might tell him something. He didn't find Daniel, but he found memories. He smiled when he saw one of the novels he loved so much and leafed through it as if searching for some trace of what was lost. He left with a new book in his hands, but without relief. Only more certain that some wounds are forever. Meanwhile, Daniel was preparing a trip with Claire. Nothing grand. Just a few days away, far from the city, in a simple cabin overlooking the mountains. It was their first trip, and something in him told him this step represented more than an escape from everyday life, it was the beginning of something solid. Claire noticed he was lighter, more present, less trapped by the pains of the past. And one cold night, sitting in front of the fireplace, she held his hand and told him she didn't want to heal him, that she didn't see him as a broken man, but rather as someone whole, who had simply spent too much time trying to piece together a story that was already over. Daniel looked at her silently, his eyes filled with something that wasn't sadness, it was gratitude. And in that moment, she knew he was ready. But even with this clarity, a dilemma remained latent, silent, like a loose thread in a nearly perfect plot. It was the moral dilemma of moving forward knowing that someone still suffered for their own choices, but unable, and unwilling, to go back. Daniel didn't wish Emily harm. He never had. But he knew that any gesture that seemed like a return would be a spark in a minefield. Forgiving her was necessary to free himself, but any excessive compassion could be mistaken for hope. And hope was something he could no longer offer. This duality accompanied him in his small gestures. Sometimes he wondered how she was, if she was still suffering, if she had found someone, if she was writing. But he pushed these thoughts away with the firmness of someone who knows that truly moving forward requires clean cuts. No matter how much it hurts, no matter how heavy it is. It was a real, human dilemma, the desire to help someone who hurt you, but the need to protect yourself above all else. One Sunday morning, while they were having coffee together on the cabin porch, Claire asked if he still thought about Emily. Daniel, honest as ever, replied that he did. That sometimes he remembered her, not with longing, but with a certain kind of respect. That each memory was proof of how much he had changed. Claire smiled and said that loving someone doesn't erase what came before, it just teaches you to love differently. Daniel squeezed her hand and felt, perhaps for the first time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Emily, on the other hand, was writing the last letter she would ever deliver. In it, she told everything. How she had destroyed something beautiful with her own hands. How she had learned more from absence than she ever would from presence. How she now understood that love isn't something you abandon in a moment of doubt, but something you cherish even on days when you feel nothing. And at the end of the letter, she wrote the sentence that perhaps summed it all up: "You were my most complete love, and I was your broken half." She folded the paper carefully, put it in a box, and locked it. It was the end of her attempt to rescue what no longer existed. Life continued for both of them. On different paths. At different paces. But with one thing in common, the understanding that love, when real, transforms, even when it ends. And that sometimes, the pain of loss is the only way to learn to value what should never have been discarded. But there was still one final moment to come. A final instant that would bring not only closure, but the final lesson. And that moment, was getting closer and closer. Time followed its course with the indifferent precision that broken hearts learn to fear. The cabin in the mountains had become a sweet memory for Daniel, almost like an invisible marker dividing what he was before and what he was beginning to become after. After everything. After Emily. After the pain. After the exhaustion. Claire, little by little, occupied spaces that had previously been zones of silence. But she didn't invade. She touched with respect, like someone who knows the weight of entering a house that has already burned down. Between them, there was a silent construction of affection. There was no urgency, no need to fill every void with words. Often, the sound of the wind or the clinking of cups in the kitchen was enough to make everything make sense. That rare kind of encounter where silence is comfortable, not awkward. One afternoon, Daniel decided to take Claire to a place he had, until then, avoided revisiting, the lake where he used to walk with Emily in the early years of their marriage. A place of memories, yes, but one that also held a beauty he refused to let die within himself. He told Claire, without embellishment, that this place had once been the setting for dreams that no longer existed. Claire, with the maturity of someone who understands that the past doesn't need to be forgotten for the present to be real, simply smiled and walked beside him. That was how they functioned. Without hiding scars, without fear of touching them. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply offered her presence, and that, for Daniel, was worth more than any declaration. Meanwhile, Emily was on another journey. She no longer sought out someone to blame, no longer rummaged through memories hoping to find some way out. She was finally accepting reality with a certain resignation that only those who suffer deeply can achieve. She had enrolled in a photography course, something she had always wanted to do but had put off out of insecurity. In the early days, she felt out of place, but soon realized that, behind the lens, she could see the world with a new kind of attention. She began photographing small things, shadows on walls, hands clasped in cafes, reflections in windows. And without realizing it, she was beginning to understand the value of observation, something she had perhaps lacked during her relationship with Daniel. It wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about learning from it. Learning to see before acting. Listening before deciding. It was on a cloudy afternoon that their paths crossed again, unexpectedly. Daniel had agreed to participate in a short lecture on sensitive architecture, held at a local library. Claire had encouraged him to accept the invitation, saying that talking about what he was passionate about was a way to heal any remaining insecurity within himself. Emily, unaware of his presence, was there by chance. She had gone to visit a photography exhibition and ended up entering the auditorium out of curiosity. When she saw Daniel up front, her eyes froze for a moment. But it wasn't the kind of pain that had previously dominated her. It was a different kind. A calm longing, without anger. He spoke confidently, but without arrogance. With simplicity, but with authority. Claire was sitting in the front row, and Emily recognized in her the lightness she had once possessed, but had lost through carelessness. After the lecture, Emily stood at the entrance to the auditorium, unsure whether to approach. She was determined not to interfere. She just wanted to see him up close one last time. However, Claire was the one who saw her first. The two stared at each other for a few seconds, and then Claire approached. The gesture itself was unexpected. Emily, surprised, offered a formal greeting, but Claire surprised her with a calm tone. She said she knew who she was, that Daniel had been honest about everything, but that there was no resentment there. Emily nodded, somewhat unsure how to react. Claire continued, saying that no one has the right to point the finger at another without knowing the weight they carry inside. And that everyone makes mistakes, some irreversible. But what really matters is what you do with what's left after the mistake. Emily lowered her gaze, overcome with emotion, and replied in a choked voice that she hoped Claire would make him happy. Claire firmly said that he was already happy, but that happiness wasn't the merit of the last come first. It was the fruit of what he decided to build, after having lost so much. Daniel approached shortly afterward. He saw the two of them talking and stopped a few steps away, watching. There was no tension. Just an awkward atmosphere of closure. When Emily saw him, she smiled honestly. He returned it with a calm look. There was no more hurt. No more desire to reclaim what had been, nor to reinvent the past. Their conversation was brief and respectful. She said she had heard the talk and was happy to see him well. He thanked her, saying he wished the same. And then, without further words, they both understood that this moment was the real goodbye. The final one. The one that doesn't require tears or scenes. Only acceptance. In the days that followed, Daniel didn't say much about the encounter. Claire didn't push it either. But there was a serenity about him that didn't go unnoticed. It was as if that final chapter had finally closed with the dignity it deserved. He no longer carried the weight of an interrupted story. He carried only the wisdom of someone who survived its end. And this was reflected in everything, in the way he walked, the way he smiled, the way he breathed. Claire was proud of him. Not for overcoming pain, but for choosing not to let that pain define him. Emily, for her part, found a new way of being. She never again engaged in rushed relationships, never again confused attention with love, nor distraction with freedom. She now lived with more calm, more awareness. She still dreamed of Daniel from time to time, but she no longer woke with tears. Only with a tightness in her chest, as if remembering something that was once beautiful but no longer belongs to the present. In one of her photography classes, she captured an image of an elderly couple sitting on a park bench, holding hands in silence. When she developed the photo, she realized she had cried. Not out of envy, nor pain. But because she finally understood that this was the love she had destroyed. And that now she could only recognize, never live again. And so, with the pieces slowly falling into place, their destinies moved forward peacefully. Parallel. Completely distinct. But connected by a story that could never be erased. A story that wasn't about betrayal, but about consequences. About how love demands presence. About how impulsive choices can cost years of peace. About how forgiveness can free, but never rebuild what was carelessly broken. The moral dilemma remained to some extent. That of knowing he had moved on while someone else was still trying to rise from their own rubble. But Daniel learned that empathy isn't the same as returning. And that the greatest proof of respect for someone you once loved is not returning just to alleviate their guilt. It's letting each person walk with the weight they chose to carry. Because in the end, love is also knowing how to leave. And never return. Even when memories still exist. Even when history still exists. Especially when there's no longer a path. A few months passed since that last chance encounter in the library, and with it came definitive changes, not only in their daily lives, but in what they carried inside. Time, with its cruel and unerring precision, put everything in its place, not erasing mistakes or soothing wounds, but making them part of what each of them had become. Daniel continued with his work routine, now more involved with projects that embraced not only concrete and glass, but also the sensitivity of the people who would occupy the spaces he created. His architecture began to have a soul, and this came not from books or technique, but from the pain he once endured in silence. His relationship with Claire had become more intense, more intimate, more solid. They lived together, but without rushing to define labels, without the anxiety of labeling each gesture as a decisive step. They were there, daily, for each other, and that was enough. There was something profound in that silent relationship, as if they had both been born ready to live alongside someone who respected their scars without trying to hide them. One ordinary evening, over a quiet dinner at home, Claire asked Daniel if he imagined what his life would have been like if nothing had happened to Emily. The question wasn't filled with judgment, but with the honesty that always guided what they shared. Daniel looked away for a moment and, with a soft sigh, said that perhaps he would have continued living a comfortable but incomplete life. That perhaps he had never understood the value of peace, of gentle love, of affection that doesn't suffocate. He said that pain had taught him to see, and that today he didn't carry resentment, but rather a silent gratitude for having awakened in time. Claire didn't answer, just held his hand firmly, as if to say without words, "I understand." Emily, for her part, no longer tried to patch up the past. After years of insisting on digging through the ruins, she finally understood that there is no reconstruction possible when the foundation was destroyed by carelessness. Living in a small apartment, now alone, she began to fill her time with new interests, personal projects, and a closer relationship with her own family, which she had long neglected. There was still a latent loneliness, but it was no longer the kind that hurts from abandonment. It was a mature loneliness, the fruit of a guilty conscience that sought not redemption, but only acceptance. Emily no longer expected Daniel to forgive her again, nor to return. His last glance in the library had made it clear that he no longer belonged anywhere she was. And for the first time, she accepted this not with anger, but with humility. The betrayal, which had previously seemed merely a thoughtless mistake, now seemed to her the exact moment she chose to leave her own story and let the other man continue alone. It was during a family event, Emily's sister's wedding, that she was confronted with the cruelest mirror of everything she had lost. Sitting alone at the table, she watched the couples dance, the smiles exchanged naturally, the spontaneous gestures of affection, and it all tightened her chest almost unbearably. Not because of someone's absence, but because of what it represented, a kind of affection she once had but couldn't preserve. A distant cousin, seeing her there in silence, approached and asked if she was okay. Emily smiled, said yes, and when asked how life was going, she responded with the sincerity of someone who no longer has anything to hide, everything's fine on the outside, but with a lot of remorse on the inside. The cousin didn't insist. He simply smiled back and walked away. And in that moment, Emily understood that that feeling would stay with her for a long time. Not as a punishment, but as a moral scar, an ethical wound that doesn't heal with pretty words or good deeds in the present. Some choices simply charge a price that cannot be paid in installments. Months later, Claire and Daniel decided to travel abroad. Not as an escape, but as a celebration of a new phase. They chose a peaceful place, where the simplicity of the days allowed for unhurried living. During the trip, one afternoon by a lake, Daniel took a discreet ring from a small box and, without formality, looked at Claire and asked if she would like to continue their story, now with a new chapter. Claire didn't cry, didn't despair, simply said, yes, with the same serenity with which she entered his life. It was the beginning of a new life, built on the foundation of everything they had experienced, including the pain he carried before meeting her. They married shortly after, in an intimate ceremony, without ostentation, but with presence. Close friends, family, sincere glances. There was no need to prove anything to the world. This was about two mature hearts choosing to share a life. Years passed. Daniel and Claire built a family. A daughter was born, and with her came the certainty that the cycle had completely renewed. Every laugh, every discovery the child made, was a reminder that love doesn't end when it ends, it transforms, shifts, redirects itself. Emily, now a photographer recognized for her sensitive and melancholic gaze, continued to live alone. She had found her voice through art, but she was never able to give herself to anyone with the same truth. Not for lack of opportunity, but because of a conscience that constantly reminded her of what she had lost. One day, she was invited to exhibit her work at a major gallery. One of her most talked about photographs showed a man walking with a child in his arms, backward, through a field of flowers. The caption was simple, "What doesn't come back?" The image was of Daniel with his daughter, taken from afar, by chance, during a trip to the same city. Emily didn't approach. He simply captured the moment and immortalized it. It was his silent way of saying goodbye once again. And so, life went on. Each with their own outcome. One built. The other accepted loss. And what remained between them was a story that, despite the pain, taught. It showed that love demands emotional responsibility. That loving isn't just about feeling, but choosing every day to preserve what you have. That betrayal doesn't just destroy a bond, it destroys the image the other person has built of you. And when that image is broken, all the forgiveness in the world can't restore it. Their story ends not with a return, but with liberation. Daniel walked away light. Claire built with him. Emily was left with the weight of her choices. But most importantly, each understood, in their own way, that true love never survives where there is disloyalty. And whoever risks the heart of someone they truly love must be willing to live with the consequence of never deserving that same love again. If this story touched you, share in the comments what you felt, what you learned from each character, and how this plot affected you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following stories like this, real, raw, and deeply human. Remember, cheating isn't just a mistake, it's a choice that destroys families, friendships, dreams, and true loves. And on this channel, we never romanticize this kind of behavior. Here, we tell these stories to serve as a mirror, a warning, a lesson. Until next time. And take good care of those who take care of you.